Hi, so going into organized convective theory in greater detail. Um, the first stage, once again, is that intense latent heat within the column. I now have a true thunderstorm forming, so I have a clearly defined updraft and a clearly defined downdraft, and I'm amassing a whole mass of thunderstorms. What's feeding into that is a low surface pressure, which increases the pressure gradient. So that means even more air is going to rush in as the low pressure increases on its set. The strong winds increase the friction, which creates choppy seas at the surface. Those choppy seas then feed into this updraft, which then has latent heat forming cloud, and these things strengthen. If I have strong convergence at the storm center, right, I then enhance the convection and everything then goes back to stage one and I keep feeding on itself. So I've created a natural engine, right? So I have a natural cycle occurring. This is known as a feedback loop. If a feedback loop is a set of things that occur that feed into a means for some type of end. And there's two types of feedback loops. There is negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops are things that occur that make something happen to keep everything the same. For example, if I had a glacier and the glacier had a little bit of melt back, but then I had snow occurring at the top of the glacier so that the melt back was equal to the snow accumulation so that the glacier continued to move forward at the same rate as the melt back. Everything stayed the same. So the end of the glacier, the terminus of the glacier was exactly the same. I would call that a negative feedback loop. Since this is a set of changes to create a change in the conditions, specifically the conditions of the atmosphere, Viva creating the storm, this is a positive feedback loop. So it's a set of actions that feed back on themselves in a looped cycle to create a change for more change. As far as pathways for most hurricanes have a natural track, and that track is to move with the trade winds. And then they actually turn northward or southward. So we call it poleward. They turn towards the poles. And so what happens with most storms is they move with the trade winds. So they move from the east to the west, and then they turn or rotate poleward. That's my natural track of most storms. With that said, some storms can behave quite erratically, being pulled in various directions with different actions. And so while most storms pull poleward, some take very interesting and erratic routes. And here is just some examples of erratic routes that storms have taken. With that said, there are certain storm routes that have higher likelihood than others, and that likelihood is greater based on season. So, for example, these are the most common storm paths in August. So, if I see a hurricane formation, these are the paths that I expect to see that storm travel. In September, I can expect these paths. September tends to be one of the most active months, too, for hurricane season. And October, I expect it to actually move up the coastline on those storm paths. So these are the most common storm paths as they travel. So getting into naming hurricanes. Now, hurricane naming prior to World War II was basically named after something that was either nearby. So like a holiday, or if it was a saint's day, they would say like, this is the storm of St. James Day. And that's how we would name it and remember it based on that. And we especially like to remember really catastrophic storms that left impacts on human well-being and livelihood. During World War II, we started practicing using women's names, kind of like we name ships. And so they adopted a natural phonetical alphabet action of those names. And so they would go about a bunch of ladies' names. And this continued with just women's names for naming hurricane season. And let me be very careful. We give every identified tropical storm a name. So even if it does not become a hurricane and hit us as a hurricane, we do name it at tropical storm stage. So for example, I would have a first tropical storm of the season, and it would be an A name. So I would name that Adriana. And Adriana may never strengthen to a hurricane, and it may never hit the United States. So I never report on it. It just stays out to ocean, but it got the A name. Then the next one comes along, and we'll name that one Betty, and Betty actually strikes land. And so everybody remembers Betty, and they're like, what happened with the A? Well, the A did happen, it just never made landfall. And a lot of hurricanes don't. A lot of tropical cyclones in general stay out to sea, or they never strengthen from tropical storm stage into a tropical cyclone. Eventually, we started having a conversation in the United States in the late 70s as to why are these storms always named after females and what is the negative connotation. And there was a slight feminist movement where like little kids wrote letters to their congressmen about how the National Ocean and Atmospheric Association should begin naming storms both male and female names. And my mother actually has a great story about writing a letter to her congressman. She remembers vividly about like how we should give them both guy names and girl names, and we should be fair to all. So in 1979, we began alternating the names. And so if the A name was tended to be a female-based name, the B name would be a male name, and we just kept going back and forth. And so that's what we go through with our naming system. Each region has their own list of names, and this is a more recent thing. So things like cyclones and typhoons that form out in the Indian and Pacific Ocean now have names, and they are culturally appropriate. So they're names for that region based on that region. But we're doing the same thing that we've done here is now adopted over there. If we run out of alphabetical names, we actually don't start the alphabet over again. We start to name them things like alpha, beta, gamma, epsilon. We actually go into that as the final part of the season naming system. So we don't just rotate the list over again. And we do retire names from the list. So right now, the National Ocean and Atmospheric actually pre-generates the name list for the season, and it's based on a few factors, one of which is population of the United States, where they just kind of go through names in the United States based on Social Security registries, right? And they take a certain, if it's something that's a name that's only named by like under 100 people in the United States have that name, they don't pick that name. So the list is higher population names. And if the name is something that'll bring up a lot of emotions by naming that, or create confusion or any type of connotation because the storm was so catastrophic or had such huge numbers of loss of life or so much damage that it would create emotional distress, we've actually retired those names. So they've taken them out of the list and we can't name them that. And some examples of retired names are Katrina, Andra, Camilla, and Hugo. We don't use those. They're taken out of the list. As far as once a tropical storm or a cyclone make landfall, we consider it the end of the storm. Once it hits landfall, we expect the storm to die out. And that's because what's feeding the engine, the fuel for the engine, is the warm surface water of the ocean. And once I cut off that warm surface water, I no longer have a huge amount of moist gas moving up through the atmosphere, which can then condense into liquid or solid material and create these cloud storms. And so it's going to stop its growth, and it's going to eventually run out of energy as it rains out everything that it's holding, or winds out. It's just going to use up all its energy in various forms. It could have electrical storms. One of the things to keep in mind is that this energy can then go about forming some minor thunderstorms, and also underneath the hurricane itself, I can get tornadoes. So one storm can spawn, one good hurricane can actually spawn a solid outbreak of tornadoes, 16 or 20 tornadoes after that storm. So just because it made landfall and we consider it the dying stages of my hurricane does not